Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be half minus buried in the soil, watching winter devour the world above your head? You can hear the sound of frost on the wood, where survival means falling into darkness rather than moving towards light. Tonight we will head to the frozen Siberian border at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. This land is so remote and so ruthless that settlers have dug out parts of their homes underground to survive. These are not temporary shelters or primitive caves, but rather well-minus considered architectural choices driven by need, originality and compliance with the harsh rhythm of winter. It helps us continue to explore these hidden passages together. Leave a comment and share where you are listening and what time it is in your world now. Perhaps you are wrapped up in the silent night. Perhaps dawn has just broken, or you find yourself somewhere in between the two. If possible, dim the lights. Perhaps let the fan hum softly in the background, ready to descend slowly, not just underground, but into a lifestyle that is almost completely forgotten. Let's get started. You wake up in the darkness, not the darkness of a windowless room, but the darkness of the earth that surrounds you on all sides, the darkness of the houses built on the ground and underground. The air is very cold. It's so cold that taking a deep breath can cause severe pain in your chest. You lay quietly for a while, wrapped in the woolen fur you had collected before going to sleep, listening to the silence. This is a kind of silence that you didn't know before you came here. The snow outside your Sri Lanka, your half-minus buried wooden house, has completely covered the world. You might as well be buried 2 feet below the ground. Even the common wind in winter cannot reach your ears. The earth itself absorbs everything. Sounds, footsteps, and even your own thoughts seem to have sunk into the earthen walls. You know it's morning only because your body tells you. No light can confirm this. There may a faint grey seeped in through the small smoke holes on the roof, a hole smaller than your fist. At night, frost formed inside the log. You can see it from the faint glow of dying embers in your fireplace. Exquisite crystals are scattered on the wood like intricate lace, beautiful yet full of hostility. All of a sudden, your fingers started to hurt before you even moved. At the night, your joints got cold. The dull and persistent stress you know never really leaves during the winter months. You must light the fire first. Everything depends on fire. The embers flickered faintly beneath a layer of ashes. You reached out for the birch bark you had saved yesterday. Your movements are slow and composed. Coaxing flames out of almost extinguished coal is a skill that you have practiced 10,000 times. You blew gently and steadily, watching the orange light flicker, until finally a small flame emerged. The fire was burning brighter and brighter, but it would still take another hour for the room to become warm enough to breathe comfortably. Now you just accept the cold, just as you accept the earthen walls around you. It is part of the structure of your existence. The widest part of your residence, maybe 12 feet wide. The wall was built with logs, with cracks of moss and clay on it, and outside the wall was raised soil on all sides. The roof is very low. You can't stand completely upright unless you are right in the middle. It is made by laying smaller logs on larger beams, then covering them with birch bark, followed by turf, and then snow. From the outside, your home is almost invisible, just a gentle hill in the scenery, soft and swollen in the snow, and occasionally smoke rises from its center. A stranger might pass by without noticing anything. Of course, this was done intentionally. The insulation capacity of earthen walls is far better than that of wooden ones. The snow accumulated on the roof becomes another layer of insulation, but it can also bring you psychological pressure in ways you never expect. Living underground will change your relationship with time and space, and alter your sense of being alive. Darkness is eternal. Even at noon, when the sun is theoretically at its highest, and a faint grey light penetrates your home, you have learned to do most of the work by feeling rather than by sight. Prepare food, mend clothes and organize stored items. All of this takes place in the eternal twilight, making the hours seem like days and the days like weeks. Smell is another constant factor. Damp land, smoke from wood, unwashed wool, and the coldness with a metallic smell that seems to have no source but always exists. Your nose couldn't distinguish these odors several weeks ago. Now they are just the smell of home. Your family shares the space. Your wife, your 2 children, your elderly mother. 5 people lived in a room the size of an ordinary storage room. There is no privacy here. You sleep in places within easy reach of each other. You eat from the same pot. You share the same air, the same darkness and the same cold. When someone is ill, everyone will know immediately. When a person is angry or sad, there is no place to retreat, no door to close, and no separate room to be alone. You have learned to interpret emotions through the tiniest signs. This silence implies resentment. Subtle changes in breathing are signals of anxiety. When a person is scared, his hands will make different movements. This kind of intimacy is both survival and a burden. The outside world is so white that it is beyond measure. The snow covered everything, reaching up to your waist. In deeper places, it had already drifted up to the trees. The forest extends infinitely in all directions. Birch trees, pine trees and arches rise from the white ground like black pillars. Their branches are covered with thick snow, and occasionally there are gentle and surprising impacts. You have learned not to be afraid of these voices. Your settlement, if it can be called like this, is probably 6 households scattered several miles away. Every family carved their own EMLY anchor on the hillside or riverbank. Everyone chooses a place close to water and wood. There is also a shared well, dug very deep and built with logs to prevent collapse. In summer, it provides cold and clean water. In winter, it becomes the focus of daily struggles. Every morning, you must walk to this well. This path has been ground into snow by the snow that has been walked repeatedly, but new snow falls every night, making it a little blurry, so you must pay attention to the road signs. A special tree, a curved sapling, and a big stone. The temperature is often -40 degrees. At this temperature, coldness is not merely discomfort. It is a physical presence, an aggressive force that can attack any exposed skin within seconds. Wrap your face with wool until only your eyes are exposed. Even so, your eyelashes are still covered with frost. If you are not careful, your breathing will freeze on your bed and from an ice surface around your mouth. The snow creaks beneath your feet, making a special sound, clear and squeaking, a sound that only occurs at such extreme temperatures. Strangely enough, this sound is pleasant and is a small sensory gift in a hostile environment. In the well, you must first break the surface ice that formed overnight. To achieve this goal, you need to keep an iron rod and strike it repeatedly until you hear a change in pitch, telling you that you have broken through. Then you carefully hung the wooden barrel on the rope, because if you dropped it into the well, it would be almost impossible to pick it up again. The rope was so frozen hard that it was very difficult to grasp. When you pulled the bucket up, water splashed out from the edge of the bucket and almost immediately froze on your gloves. Despite being wrapped in thick woolen leather, your fingers start to lose sensation within minutes. You pour the water into the big wooden bucket you brought. Hold a bucket in each hand to balance the load. The water is very cold and evaporates in the air, forming brief clouds almost as fast as they form. It takes about 15 minutes to walk back to your Sri Lanka. Because of the weight, because of the cold, and because I have been walking the same route every day for several months, it feels like the time is getting longer. Your shoulders hurt, your back hurts, and your fingers go from pain to numbness. This is almost worse because numbness is a warning sign before frostbite begins. Once again, you carefully put the bucket down. Some water is used for cooking, some for drinking and some for washing clothes. Although in the depth of winter, the washing is more theoretical than practical. Hang your hand close to the fire, but not too close. You already know that warming up frozen fingers too quickly can cause extreme pain. You let the heat gradually reach their bodies and watch them feel the recovery in stages. First comes a sharp pain, then a deep pain, and finally a feeling close to normal. Your wife has already started to prepare breakfast. Breakfast is very simple. A thin porridge made from stored grains. If you're lucky, you can have a piece of dried fish. The black is too hardened, must be softened in hot water before it can be chewed. The grains you use to cook porridge come from your underground storage depot. A deeper room was dug under the floor of your main room. There, the temperature remains above 0 all year round, cold enough to preserve food, but not to freeze it into a solid. Climbing down the storage pit always makes one a little nervous. The ladder is rough in tone and smooth in texture. The room itself is completely dark and requires you to work alone. You have organized your stall very well. Put the grains in a bark container to prevent moisture. The root vegetables are piled up in the corner. Dried fish are hung on nails, nailed to the soil and walls. Store berries in earthenware jars sealed with animal fat. Everything must last until spring, but spring seems out of reach. Root vegetables, such as radishes, beets and carrots, all have a strong earthy smell, no matter how carefully you brush them clean. This vulgarity is not unpleasant, but it is inevitable. It reminds you that you live in the soil and also belong to it. Your child can help prepare food. Your 7-year-old daughter knows how to pick out dried berries and remove anything that shows signs of mold. Your son, who is not yet 5 years old, is learning to chop firewood with a small axe under serious supervision. He is still too young to understand that his entire childhood was spent underground, nor does he understand that children in other places play in sunny and flower-filled gardens. For him, this is life. Darkness, cold, endless repetition. None of these are hardships but normal circumstances. You are grateful for his tenacity, even if you feel sad about things he has never known. After breakfast, there were problems with the animals. You have two goats. If you are lucky, you can also raise a cow. Although raising a cow in the winter of Siberia is a huge challenge. These animals live in a separate structure, although separate is a broad term. This is another earthen house dug up the hillside, connected to your main residence through a short covered passage, so you don't need to go out to take care of them. This arrangement has multiple uses. The body heat of animals helps provide warmth for your living space. You can take care of them without facing the extreme outdoor temperatures, and they won't be harmed by wolves and other predators that become desperate in the deep winter. The architectural logic is reasonable, even if the result is that a residence always gives off the smell of livestock. When you enter the animal room, your eyes will adapt to a dimmer light than in the main room. The goat kept moving and making soft sounds. Breathing clouds can be seen in the cold air. If this cow could live as long as winter, she would stand there with her unique patience. Her big, black eyes reflected the tiny ray of light seeping in through the crack. She looks very haggard. At this time of the season, they are all haggard but still alive, still providing a small amount of milk to supplement your diet in a way you can't afford to lose. You scrape off the soiled straw from the floor and replace it with less and less fresh straw. The smell of feces blends with that at high end, the warmth of animals, creating a special atmosphere that is both unpleasant and comfortable. The survival of these creatures depends entirely on you, and you also depend on them. Without their milk, without their final meat, without their skin and bones, you can't get through the winter. During the short summer, when the grassland is temporarily accessible, you carry the hay for them, cut the dried grass and store it. These animals eat very slowly and in an organized manner. You need to observe whether they show any signs of illness or weakness. Sick animals in winter may mean the difference between survival and starvation. You have learned to notice the subtle changes. The angle of the ears, the brightness of the eyes, and the rhythm of chewing. When you milk the goat, your fingers are still very cold. Although the fire in your room is gradually warming up, the milk trickles down gently, for less than in summer, but still more than enough. You carefully carried the wooden bowl of milk through the connecting passage. Your wife will use some immediately, leave some for the children, and let some cephalent separate so that the cream can be skimmed off and stirred into butter. At cold temperatures, this is a tough process, but it can produce valuable fat. By around 10 a.m., although morning is an arbitrary name in a world without bright sunlight, you must turn your attention to the most urgent issue minus firewood. The fire cannot be extinguished. Never can it be extinguished, because reigniting it with a damp flame in cold weather is a painful thing, and sometimes an impossible task. You often need firewood. The speed at which the fire consumed wood was so fast that it would surprise those unfamiliar with the climate here. Every day, several arms of wood were consumed without exception. Your wood is piled up outside, covered with bark and snow, and seems to have shrunk significantly. Even though you carefully ration it, you know you have to venture into the forest regularly to replenish it. a task that fills you with exhausted determination. You prepare to collect wood just as you treat everything in winter. Layer upon layer of clothes, wrapped around the face, mittens on gloves, and felt boots wrapped in leather strips. Every piece of clothing is indispensable. Even if one layer is missing, it may lead to dangerous exposure. Place your axe inside near the fire so that the metal remains relatively warm and your hand won't stick to it. You also need to bring a rope to drag the wood, a small amount of time eaters energy, and flint in case of disaster. You need to make an emergency fire. Outside, the cold is like a blow to the body. No matter how many times you have experienced it, this initial temperature shock will never abate. The air itself is full of hostile feelings, and breathing too deeply can damage the lungs. You stood for a while, allowing your body to adjust, and your eyes scanned the surrounding scenery. The dark forest is beckoning to you, and you start to walk along the memory path you have repeatedly used towards the forest. The snow here is deeper and far from the dense areas near your home. With each step you take, you need to raise your feet, overcome resistance, and carefully lower them to avoid the invisible holes in your thighs that might sink. When you approach those trees, they stand in the silence of winter, with each branch covered in snow, which has accumulated over several weeks. To find good dead wood, it is necessary to be dry enough to burn effectively, but not rotten to the point of being fragile. This requires experience and patience. You found a fallen pine tree with a trunk diameter of about 8 inches, partially buried. You clear the snow with your hands wearing mittens and assess whether it is worth cutting and moving. The wood looks very solid. You start to cut it into easier parts to handle. Your axe strikes the frozen wood with a dull impact, leaving almost no echo in the snow minus covered in dark forest. Every time you swing an axe, it consumes energy that you can hardly bear. Your breathing becomes more difficult, and you feel sweat starting to seep out from under your clothes. The danger is that once you stop exercising, the frozen sweat will kill you. Adjust your pace, chop rhythmically but not crazily, and let the weight of the axe do most of the work. Cut, swing, a certain sense of contemplation. This repetition creates a space where thoughts can rift. When doing this job, you sometimes think of summer, warm and distant memories, memories that can move freely, memories of seeing green things grow out of the soil, rather than endless white. These memories feel increasingly unreal, like the stories others tell you rather than the experiences you have truly gone through. When you cut them into several pieces of appropriate size, you tie them together and start dragging them back to your Sri Lanka. The sled you might be using is broken and waiting to be repaired, so you have to drag the logs directly through the snow. The weight is huge and your back immediately protests. You throw yourself into your work, pull steadily, and occasionally stop to rest, making sure you are still on the right track. Although you are very familiar with these forests, it is always possible to get lost in them. Every autumn, snow subtly changes the landscape, and white conditions may suddenly appear, erasing all landmarks within minutes. Your navigation is partly based on memory, partly on the faint position of the sun, and when you can spot it in the overcast sky, partly on the instinct formed through repeated practice. Every successful round trip is like a small victory. Back in your Sri Lanka, you pile up the new wood near the entrance and then take a few pieces into dry by the fire. Damp wood burns inefficiently, filling your home with smoke. So you have learned to constantly rotate the fragments, dry some and burn others. The afternoon tasks don't change much every day. If there is enough light, your wife works on her loom, weaving the coarse cloth that you need to repair and replace. The sound of the loom was surprisingly soothing, with rhythmic banging and sliding sounds, banging unsliding sounds. A human voice in the silent season. She weaves not only by sight, but also by feeling. Her fingers followed the pattern she had learned in her childhood. Your mother, advanced in age and increasingly frail, sits by the stove, doing any little thing her arthritis-stricken hand can still do. Sometimes she would peel the dried peas out of the pots. Sometimes she sorts out the wool to spin into yarn. Sometimes she just sits there reminiscing. Occasionally, she would talk about her childhood spent in a village that now seems out of reach, where there were churches and markets, neighbors' houses were on the ground, and the seasons actually changed in a predictable way. You listen to these stories absent-mindedly, both grateful for the connection with the larger world and resentful that such a world would always be out of reach. Your children create their own gains in a limited space. They built small structures with sawdust. They told each other stories borrowed from their grandmother's memory. They argued and reconciled in the compressed space. Sometimes they go out to play, but in the depth of winter, these short trips are very short, lasting only 10 minutes, at most 15 minutes, and then the cold will drive them back underground. You watch them roll back from the door, their cheeks red from the cold and their eyes bright. Their brief outdoor experience had vanished. The evening came very early, almost no different from the afternoon. The quality of the darkness has slightly changed, and if possible, it has even become more complete. Light a small oil lamp made of precious fish oil. If you can afford it, carefully allocate 1 or 2 hours. The shadows cast by the flames dance on the ground and walls, making the space feel larger or smaller than it actually is. Dinner is very similar to breakfast. Porridge, a thin stew's bread. And if you still have some cured meat occasionally. You eat very slowly. Part of it is to taste the food, and the other part is that eating slowly makes you feel there is more. When having a conversation, keep your voice down. It's not because you need to stay quiet, but because speaking loudly in this dull space will make people feel something is off. What you are talking about are practical issues, such as how much firewood is left, whether the goats need more care, and which tools need repaired before they are completely broken. Your wife mentioned that your daughter's boots were worn out and needed to be mended immediately. Your son showed how he counted from 20. Now, this is a skill that his grandmother taught him on long and dark afternoons. After the meal, there was nothing else to do except sit by the stove waiting to go to sleep. This might be the most difficult part of the day. Work is over, but sleep hasn't come yet. When you are alone and your thoughts have nowhere to go, you will think that spring will eventually come. Although it seems impossible for you to fully believe it, you will think of the crops you will grow, the possibility of repairing your home, and the possibility of hunting fresh meat again. But spring is more like a myth than a promise. Things that people claim to exist, but you don't have real evidence. Winter has lasted for a long time, making people feel that it is eternal and a basic condition for survival, rather than a season that will pass. The fire burned even lower. You added another piece of wood and watched the flames burn larger and larger. You felt the warmth on your face temporarily increase. Your child fell asleep first, curled up together and covered under the fur and blanket they shared. Her breathing became slow and regular, and you envied them for being so completely out of consciousness. Your mother is sleeping beside her, snoring loudly in the confined space. Your wife stayed awake with you for a while, not saying a word, just existing nearby. Finally, you carefully make the fire, cover the burning wood with ashes to slow it down at night, and then lie on your own bed. The ground beneath your feet is very hard, although there are layers of strand cloth between your body and the compacted ground. As the fire went out, cold immediately hit. You pull your fur and blanket tighter, but from experience you know that no matter how carefully you prepare, you will feel cold in the morning. You lie in the darkness, listening to the silence. Sometimes you will hear snow gently sliding down from the roof. Sometimes you may hear the creaking sound made by wood as it shrinks in the cold. Sometimes you can hear nothing but the blood in your ears. Sleep will eventually come, though not deeply. You stayed partially awake throughout the night, monitoring the fire situation, listening to the problems, and getting ready to fully wake up if necessary. Finally, you wake up in the darkness again. It is not the darkness of a room without windows, but the darkness of the earth that surrounds it on all sides. The air is very cold. It's so cold that taking a deep breath can cause severe pain in your chest. You lay still for a while, knowing without thinking that this was morning, simply because your body told you so. The pace of your life goes on, and almost every day is the same. Each one requires the same task, to be accomplished in the same order and with the same determination. This was the significance of the frontier settlers in Siberia during winter in the early 19th century. There is no adventure, no glory, not even any particularly memorable pain. There is only repetition, only coldness, only the quiet struggle to live on until the possibility of warmth returns. If it returns, if the spring that everyone promises truly exists somewhere beyond this endless white silence. Now let's shift from the general rhythm of settled life to a thread in a larger fabric. This story tells of the existence of a woman whose existence indicates what the facts of survival actually mean in the years of transforming from a child to an old person, living through a specific consciousness in a particular body. Maria Sidorenna was born in 1789 in a small village near Kazan, where a Volga river meanders through farmland but has been cultivated for centuries. Her earliest memory was not snow but sand and dust, the golden sand and dust at the end of summer. Under the afternoon sun, her father was working on the small piece of land. Her family is neither rich nor extremely poor. They occupied the uncertain middle ground and survived through continuous labor, but disasters always led to a poor harvest. Her father, Cedor Mikiewicz, was a farmer who worked on the land of a minor nobleman. He repaid his debts with food and labor. Over the years, although this arrangement was not very comfortable, it was also very effective. But in 1796, when Maria was 7 years old, poor harvests and controversial measurements led to her father being accused of defaulting on the landlord's grain. Whether these accusations are true or false becomes irrelevant once they are raised. As a result, the machine began to run frantically. This family is heavily in debt. It's not the kind of debt that can be settled through a bountiful harvest and careful budgeting, but rather the kind of interest and penalties that keep accumulating until the initial amount owed almost becomes an accidental debt. Maria's father tried to defend himself in front of the landlord's butler. She remembered watching him prepare for the meeting, rehearsing his words, and trying to present their situation in a way that might bring mercy rather than further punishment. When he came back from the meeting, he walked differently from before. His shoulders had bent into a shape he had never bent before. The butler remained unmoved. What was worse, she regarded her father's defense as a rebellion against authority. A few months later, the solution emerged in the form of a government decree, which spread throughout the region. The Siberian region needs immigrants, workers to establish agricultural communities in sparsely populated frontier areas, indebted families, families with legal difficulties, and families with no prospects. Everyone was given what the authorities called the opportunity. Informally, everyone regarded this as a moderate form of exile, a way to break away from the problem population of Russia in Europe while developing its eastern dependencies. Maria's family was given a choice, but it wasn't a real one. Move to Siberia with moderate resettlement fees and land commitments, or face the consequences of their accumulated debts in other ways. Her father chose Siberia, although using the word choice to describe him actually meant accepting the least destructive option. It took several months to travel eastward. They traveled slowly along the roads in caravans composed of equally displaced families, which deteriorated further away from the established settlements. 7-year-old Maria initially found this journey exciting. She has never left a few miles away from her hometown, where the ever-changing scenery, forests being replaced by plains, rivers getting wider and wider, and settlements becoming fewer and fewer, all have an adventurous nature. That as week after week of traveling went on, the excitement gradually wore off. The novel life of sleeping in a carriage and eating beside a public fire was replaced by the monotony interrupted by occasional events. The wheels of the carriage were broken, the child was ill, and there were disputes among families over supply or space. As they traveled, her mother became quieter and quieter, speaking less and less every day. Maria didn't understand at that time what she later realized. Her mother was mourning not only the loss of her home, but also all the future deaths she had imagined for her children. In the late autumn of 1797, they arrived at the designated settlement. Maria had never heard of the name of this place. People merely refer to it by its administrative name, which is a combination of letters and numbers and holds no meaning for those living there. What they discovered was not a village but some rough shelters scattered along the riverbank, surrounded by continuous forests. Before them, several families came here, and more families will come later, but the population of this settlement will never exceed 12 or 15 households. The first winter was the hardest because they lived in a house that was just enough. Her family's original Sri Lanka was hastily excavated without the refinement that later experiences taught them. Water seeped through the soil and the walls. The logs on the roof were not sealed well, allowing cold air to seep in through the gaps. The position of the exhaust hole was not good, causing the smoke from the furnace to be drawn into their living space instead of being effectively vented. Maria remembered that winter. Her eyes were constantly burning, and every morning her tears would flow down from the accumulated smoke. The hunger she remembered was not the acute hunger caused by famine, but the long-term hunger resulting from insufficient food. They brought supplies for the journey and the initial settlement period, but these supplies ran out before local food production could fully replace them. Her father spent the first winter in despair. He was promised farmland, but the land he was not like the cultivated land in their hometown. This forest has hardly been cut down. It is full of tree roots and drops everywhere and requires a large amount of labor to grow crops. Besides, the growing season in this distant north is much shorter than he knew. Crops that ripen in Kazan will not ripen here before the frost. He must learn new technologies, new crop varieties and new schedules, and at the same time strive to make his family have a longer and colder winter than any winter he has experienced before. During those months, Maria watched her father grow old, watching his hands become roughened, permanently damaged due to working in the extremely cold environment. Looking at his voice losing its authority, it presented a tone of continuous failure. Her mother adapted in a different way. She became very pragmatic, concentrating on the task at hand, almost as absorbed as in meditation. She carefully organized their underground residence. She developed a system to manage their food supply, rotate their limited clothes to ensure even distribution, and maintain some small rituals, such as praying before meals and singing before going to bed. All these made them feel continuous with their lost past lives. Maria learns from her parents in different ways. From her father, she learned the ability to face obvious futile resolutions and keep striving even when success seemed impossible. From her mother, she learned practical family knowledge, which will become the foundation of her survival. How to judge the quality of pickled foods, how to mend clothes so that the mending is almost invisible, how to manage fires, smoke and limited light, how to create the appearance of order even when it is essentially characterized by chaos. These skills are not imparted through formal teaching, but are absorbed through daily observation and participation. By the age of 10, Maria had accomplished many tasks that determined her adult life. She pulled water from the river and broke through the ice on the water surface with the special techniques she needed. Don't just throw it down directly, as that would knock the ice far away and be very dangerous. Instead, chisel a hole in a circular shape without destabilizing the surrounding surface. She learned to take care of the goats at home. Through constant approach, she used an intuition to understand their needs and emotions. She learned which wild plants could supplement their diet during the short summer and which plants, despite their attractive appearance, were actually very dangerous. She learned to recognize the signs of the approaching weather, the special nature of the light before a snowstorm, the behavior of birds before a severe drop in temperature, and the sounds made by the wind passing through different types of trees, which depend on the humidity in the air. These are all life-saving skills, not just interesting observations, because being unprepared for weather changes can mean death. But Maria also maintains an inner life that is not entirely consumed by survival. She was drawn in by the story, the one her grandmother told before she passed away in the first winter, the stories that merchants occasionally bring when they pass by here in search of furs. These stories were created by her on long and gloomy afternoons, when she had nothing to do but sit and wait for the arrival of spring. She imagined other places, intensely, and almost felt pain. She imagined the city with stone churches and paved streets, markets filled with goods she had never seen before, and a particularly suffocating feeling that people had never experienced, spending 6 months of winter underground in their entire lives. These imaginations are not really for escape. Even when she was a child, She knew that her situation was permanent, but she wanted to maintain a feeling that the world was more than what her daily life showed her. They are a resistance to the shrinking possibilities brought about by life on the frontier. Maria's father passed away when she was 13. This is not dramatic. One morning he just didn't wake up. His body had finally exhausted its ability to keep working. This timing is particularly cruel because it occurs in early spring, right at the worst time of winter. He died on the verge of a season he could have enjoyed. His death indicates that survival is not merely a matter of enduring the winter, but rather a matter of maintaining vitality through the accumulated injuries over multiple winters. His death fundamentally changed Maria's position in the family. At the age of 13, she became a major laborer, responsible for the work her father did. She learned to use the axe effectively, although her small size meant she got tired more easily. She learned to negotiate with her neighbors to share the labor during critical periods, such as harvest or major overhauls. She learned about the special social dynamics of a small isolated settlement, where everyone was interdependent, but also competing for the same limited resources. Maintaining a good relationship with neighbors is a necessary condition for survival. However, these neighboring countries will not hesitate to take advantage of the weaknesses of the United States. Her mother is now a widow and lives in the most isolated and difficult circumstances imaginable. She pays more attention to maintaining the family's survival ability. When making decisions, she is cold and pragmatic, which sometimes shocks Maria, refusing to share food with sick neighbors because they can't afford. The loss of a fierce quarrel over the border issue. This forced Maria to work until she was completely exhausted because the work had to be completed. Maria understood at that time that this kind of harshness was not cruel but necessary, and others relied entirely on willpower to ensure their survival. Sacrificed indigenous, for it is a luxury they cannot afford. From the age of 13 to 18, I spent my time in repetitive labor, and occasionally something would break the monotonous life. A fire broke out in a household in Sri Lanka, resulting in the deaths of 2 children. The burns on the parents' bodies never healed. A dispute over a shared hunting area escalated into violence, resulting in a man's lifelong limping and creating tensions that lasted for several years. During the reconciliation, an exceptionally warm summer allowed the crops to grow unexpectedly vigorously, creating a brief and almost dazzling sense of prosperity, and the next winter brought them back to the familiar struggle. Over the years, Maria has gradually become a trustworthy person, someone who would fulfill the tasks she promised to undertake, someone who could use borrowed tools or share responsibilities, and someone who could maintain a stable demeanor even in difficult circumstances. This reputation, gradually built up through countless tiny interactions, is more valuable than any material wealth. When Maria was 18 years old, a man named Pote came to this settlement. He is about 10 years older than her and is a hunter. For many years, he has been moving between distant settlements and forest camps, leading a semi-minus nomadic life and tracking breeding animals. Traditionally speaking, he is not handsome. His face was weather-minus beaten and scarred, and his hands were so rough that he couldn't even do the hard agricultural labor. The way he speaks is so stiff as to be rude, but he possesses the skills needed in the area. More importantly, he has the ability to show that he can survive in any situation. Their courtship, if it could be called courtship, was completely realistic. He needs a permanent base instead of moving frequently. He realized that Maria's family provided all these. She needs a man's labor to complete those tasks that are beyond her physical capacity. She realized that most people in Quiethistory could do it. They negotiated the terms of the partnership with those who directly arranged business transactions, because romance was another luxury that life on the border could not accommodate. They got married at a brief ceremony presided over by a traveling priest who passed through the area irregularly. The priest stayed for one night, presiding over for weddings and 6 baptisms, and then continued on to the next settlement. There were no celebrations, no feasts, and no gatherings of extended families to commemorate this moment. Marie and Pote simply united their family and continued to survive, now as partners rather than individuals. This arrangement has proved to be effective. The Pote people have been away from their ZMLINK for a long time, walking along the trapline through the forest and occasionally going to more distant settlements to trade fur. When he came back, he would bring some meat and fur for trade or personal use. Occasionally, he would also bring some barter items, salt, metals and tools. Once, it was a small mirror that Maria absurdly cherished. He was away for a long time, but Maria continued to operate independently to a large extent, managing their family-owned land. Her ability was the same as before his arrival, but when he was there, his appearance made certain aspects of life obviously much easier. He can cut down trees more quickly, handle the heavy work that would take Maria twice as long to complete, and be in a greater social leverage position in negotiations with authorities or businessmen. Their relationship is not characterized by romantic intimacy, but rather by mutual respect that develops through the display of abilities. They worked very well together because they all knew what needed to be done and completed the task, without the need for constant discussion or emotional handling. In 1812, when Maria was 23 years old, this settlement was facing what the locals called a famine winter, although it was never recorded in official history. Last summer was unusually cool and humid, which hindered the ripening of crops. The harvest may only be 40% of what was expected. Every family's reserves are already running low before winter arrives. Everyone knows that the coming season will bring them an unprecedented test. Food rationing begins immediately. Usually, insufficient food becomes merely symbolic. A few spoons of grains cooked in water, a small piece of dried fish shared among four people, and more bread made of tree bark and moss rather than flour. The family members began to desperately calculate whether they could survive. Some people choose to send their older children to other settlements, where distant relatives might take them in. They believe that separating families will offer better opportunities for everyone. Others refuse to part, believing that they will live or die together. At that time, Maria's family, including her mother, Pote and herself, all chose to stay together, although this decision was being tested every day because their food reserves were dwindling under almost none. In the middle stage, people began to eat things that would usually be discarded. The leather shavings were cooked to the point where they could hardly be chewed. Bark is stripped from some trees and processed into a paste. The bark roots are dug out from frozen soil, which requires tremendous effort but yields the least nutritional return. The goats were slaughtered one by one, which temporarily relieved the pressure but also eliminated the future source of milk. Maria still remembers the extraordinary hunger that winter. Not only the physiological sensation of fasting, but also the way it affects thinking, making it impossible for people to concentrate and eventually directing all their thoughts back to food, no matter where they start. She remembered that in her dream, there was a sumptuous meal. When she woke up, her face was covered in tears. The satisfaction in her imagination was cruel, followed by the emptiness of reality. But apart from her own pain, she still remembers the social changes brought about by hunger. Families that had cooperated for many years began to suspect each other. The accusation of hoarding was made without evidence. Petty theft occurs from time to time. What is stolen is not valuable items but leftovers, small amounts of grains and anything edible. The appearance of civilization was originally very thin in such an environment, but now it has become almost transparent. What people do will make them feel ashamed in the future, but at this moment, shame is powerless to resist the intense desire to go on living. Maria herself was also involved in this transformation, although she tried to maintain some moral boundaries. When a neighbor's store was rotten and destroyed, a disaster left them facing hunger. Maria and Pot did not help them. They can't help them otherwise. They will endanger their own survival. In the end, they didn't. The youngest child of her neighbor passed away at the end of winter. Maria attended the funeral with a complex mixture of grief, guilt and terrifying relief, for it was not her own family that suffered the loss. During this period, Maria stood out not because she avoided moral compromise, which would have been impossible, but because she remained somewhat clear-headed about what was happening. She didn't pretend that their actions were generous. In fact, they were just doing it for self-protection. She didn't fabricate a story of justice to defend their decision. She merely admitted that survival sometimes requires making tough choices, and these choices will accompany us throughout our lives. This clarity has a practical purpose. It prevents self-deception that could lead to even worse decisions. By maintaining an honest assessment of their situation and behavior, she helps her family focus on realistic strategies rather than desperate gambling. Spring has finally come, belatedly and reluctantly. Before the true warmth arrives, it brings muddied cold rain. This settlement has already lost 3 families. 2 of them have completely died, and 1 has left their land for an unknown destination, probably hoping to find a better environment elsewhere. When the survivors emerged from this island, they were already haggard and had suffered visible or invisible injuries. Maria may have lost 70 pounds compared to last summer. Her hair is obviously sparse. The teeth on her gums are loose. Her menstrual cycle has completely stopped. Her body has decided that it cannot reproduce under the current conditions. These physical signs of extreme poverty take several months to recover. Some of the effect may be permanent, but the psychological ones may be more significant. The social structure of this settlement was torn apart in winter, and even with food available, the cracks were not fully healed. Once trust is broken under extreme conditions, it is very difficult to restore. People remember those who refused to help, those suspected of stealing, and those who quarreled for no reason because hunger made everyone irritable. Maria found that she now views her neighbors differently. She no longer regards them as community members but as potential threats or potential resources depending on the circumstances. She didn't like this new way of observing, but she couldn't simply let herself return to her previous innocence. In the summer of 1813, people were incredibly busy. They used the few seeds that had left to grow crops, search for any edible plants, hunt and fish at a new intensity, and try to build up reserves to prevent another disastrous winter. Physical labor is huge, but it is also psychologically welcome because it replaces the need to think carefully about what they have experienced. Maria kept working until her body could no longer function, then took a short break and continued working. This summer turned into a chaos of planting, preservation and preparation. Gradually, very gradually, the settlement began to regain some normal feelings. The body regained the lost weight, but never fully returned to the state before the famine. Social relationships were renegotiated. Some people became closer through shared trauma, while others were permanently damaged. Maria found herself a member of an informal leadership group, not through any formal appointment, but through ability and stable natural gravity. Other women, especially the young ones who survived the famine, began to seek her advice. How to preserve fish most effectively, how to determine whether the stored food is still safe to eat, how to manage limited resources throughout the winter, and how to make rationing decisions when there are no good options. Maria shared what she knew, but she also honestly admitted that her knowledge was limited. She told them that without any guarantee, meticulous planning could still lead to disaster. Survival often depends on factors beyond anyone's control, such as weather, disease, and sheer chance. This honesty not only failed to undermine her authority, but seemed to strengthen it instead. People trust those who admit uncertainty more than those who pretend to know everything. In 1815, Maria gave birth to her first child, a daughter, in spring when conditions were as favorable as ever. Her pregnancy was unexpected. It took her body several years to regain sufficient fertility to conceive. The process of giving birth was very difficult. In the dim Sri Lanka, only her mother and a neighbor woman helped. For several hours, Maria had been living in a space beyond her and normal consciousness, where pain and effort were intertwined, until she couldn't tell which was which. But the child survived, and so did Maria. In the days following the child's birth, she experienced a feeling she had never had in years. A hope not based on actual calculations, but a simple emotional response to the new life. She named her daughter Katerina, which to some extent represents the possibility that nothing else had for a long time in Maria's life. Raising children in remote areas means constantly balancing their needs with existing resources. Maria took care of Catalina for as long as possible, on the one hand for nutrition and on the other hand because it delayed the recovery of her fertility. Getting pregnant too early again is dangerous for both the mother and the child. She makes stories with wood chips and cloth chips. She tells stories during the long and dark winter. She tried to create some childhood happiness, although the environment was fundamentally not conducive to happiness. Watching Katerina's growth, Maria found herself contemplating a future beyond survival. Perhaps her daughter will see that the situation has improved. Perhaps this settlement will develop into a genuine town, with convenient facilities and opportunities. Perhaps a Catalina would not spend her entire life underground, struggling against cold, hunger and endless repetition. These are all fragile hopes that can be easily shattered by the assessment of reality, but Maria still keeps them alive. Then there were two more children. One son was born in 1817 and died of a winter disease after only 6 months. The other daughter was born in 1819 and survived. Her name was Anna. Every pregnancy is an adventure, every delivery is a test, and every baby is a mixture of joy and extra burden. Maria's body bears the marks of multiple pregnancies and years of arduous childbirth. Her figure has changed permanently, and her health condition has become increasingly obvious as she grows older. But the children also gave her the motivation to keep going and made her realize that the meaning of life is not just about persistence. Piete continued his pattern of long minus-term absence and periodic returns. His hunting and trapping provided the necessary resources, but his presence in the children's lives was negligible. By the standards of that era and that place, he was neither cruel nor indifferent, but he did not appear in a way that created emotional bonds either. The children knew that he was a person who showed up occasionally with gifts and stories, rather than one who often took care of children. This arrangement is quite normal for families in border areas, as men's work often requires mobility, while women's work centers on maintaining family stability. Maria didn't hold a grudge, but she also realized that although she was married, she was basically raising her children alone. As Maria entered her 30s, she increasingly became a central figure in the informal social structure of the settlement. She mediates family disputes. She suggested sharing the labor arrangements. She retains the collective memory of this settlement. Who helped whom? Who helped whom? Who owes something? Which agreements have been reached and need to be adhered to? This role has no official authority and no material rewards, but it gives her a kind of social capital that can be transformed into actual benefit. When her family needs help, people are more likely to offer it, because they know that Maria will repay them when the situation reverses. Over the years, the settlement itself has undergone slow changes. Some families are unable to make ends meet, or are driven away by accumulated misfortune. The arrival of some new families has brought in new labor forces, but it has also disrupted the established social patterns. The total quantity fluctuates between 40 and 70 depending on the year. It has never grown to a scale sufficient to support critical infrastructure, but has maintained sufficient continuity to preserve institutional memory. As residents gain experience and resources, the lane gradually improves. Marie and Potte expanded their residence, adding a better ventilation system and more complex storage rooms. They combined the techniques learned from the indigenous people, which were much longer than those that Russian immigrants had lived in the region, as well as methods of heat insulation, smoke prevention and food preservation, which were more effective than those brought by the immigrants from Europe and Russia. These adaptations represent a silent recognition that survival requires learning from local knowledge rather than adhering to foreign traditions. In 1828, when Maria was 39 years old, a travel official came here to conduct a census of the border settlement. It took him 3 days to record names, family composition and basic economic data. Maria is one of the more eloquent residents in this settlement and she was interviewed in detail. The official inquired about her life, her family history, and her observations on settlement conditions. She answered his questions as straightforwardly as she did in any interaction, neither exaggerating the difficulties out of sympathy nor belittling them out of pride. The official recorded her responses in a ledger, which would eventually end up in an archive that no one had read for generations. But in the interview, Maria realized that she was a historical subject and her experiences might interest people from other eras and places. His thought was strange and a bit uncomfortable, as if a lamp had illuminated certain aspects of her life that she had never considered from an external perspective. The officials seemed to be both impressed by the settlers, resilient and shocked by their situation. He made all kinds of promises about improvement and support, and Maria knew that these promises would not be fulfilled. She had heard similar promises before and learned not to base her plans on them. But his visit did highlight the huge gap between the official understanding of border settlements and the actual life experiences of those settlements. In the administrative report, the community was successful. The land is being cultivated, population is sustainable, the frontier is expanding. In fact, they are people who have survived through tremendous efforts under basically marginal and unstable conditions. Both of these viewpoints have their accuracies, but the realities they describe are so different that they hardly seem to be in the same place. When Maria entered her 40s, her health began to show the cumulative effects of decades of hard life. Her joints often hurt, especially in cold weather. Her teeth are basically gone and she can eat some food. 2 years of heavy labor and malnutrition during her growth period, a permanent curve formed on her back. She gets tired more easily than she did a few years ago. In this case, all of these are normal effects of aging. Most pioneers who lived to middle age also showed similar degeneration. But Maria also noticed that her role in the community was changing. Nowadays, younger women come to her not merely for practical advice, but for something more difficult to define, a perspective that can only be obtained after decades of repeated hardships without a complete collapse. She found herself telling stories more often, not dramatic ones, but simply describing early life, people who have now passed away, and changes that occurred so slowly that the young residents hardly noticed them. Unintentionally, she became a guardian of collective memory, someone who could provide context and continuity. In 1835, Potte did not return from a long hunting expedition. Several weeks have passed, but there has been no news about his expected return date. Maria waited with a strange feeling of both concern and helplessness. She had always known that his absence would bring the risk of accidents, illness, or simply getting lost in the vast forest. 2 months later, she accepted the fact that he might have been dead. Although it has not been confirmed, she cannot be sure either. Its practical significance is considerable. She lost his labor force and the income he earned from the fur trade, making her family's financial situation even more unstable. That the emotional impact is complex and she finds it hard to express. She was very sad, but she didn't have the intense feeling of suddenly losing a loved one. Cotte has been absent for too long. His prolonged absence feels like a continuation of a temporary absence, rather than a fundamental change. She missed him, but throughout their entire marriage, she had been missing him on and off. The sense of loss is most intense when his special skills and knowledge could have been put to good use, rather than an emotional deficiency. It is a practical one. Maria continued to manage the household with the help of her daughter. At this time, Ekaterina was 20 years old and Anna was 16. Both had reached the age when they could engage in adult labor. Together, they maintain as an anchor, cultivate their land and manage the remaining animals. They operate in a settlement in the form of female families. Most of the labor patterns are organized around male-female partnerships, which brings certain challenges but also a certain degree of freedom. They can make decisions without consulting with male authorities. They can arrange their time according to their own priorities. They can keep all the fruits of their labor instead of sharing them. These are all insignificant advantages. But in their environment, any advantage is important. The settlement continued its slow and almost imperceptible changes. A few families achieved moderate prosperity through successful fur trade or rare good harvests. Others fall into extreme poverty and have to rely on community charities. The gap between the most successful and the least successful families has widened, creating new social tensions. Maria observed these dynamics with a detached interest, just as a person knows that the environment can change rapidly in any direction, and it is foolish to mistake a temporary advantage for a permanent one. She maintains good relations in all economic fields of the settlement and refuses to ally with any specific faction. This neutrality requires constant and delicate work, helping some families and refusing to help others, and not standing on the side that would create permanent enemies when resolving disputes. This is tiring in itself, but it is also necessary to maintain the status of the family. In her 50s, Maria began to feel for a period of time that she was experiencing her life from a slight distance, as if she were watching the movements she was performing rather than being completely immersed in them. To be precise, this is not unpleasant, but it makes people lose their way. Sometimes she wonders if this is merely the feeling of aging, or if decades of continuous hardship have created some kind of protective separation. She didn't think carefully about these questions. Self-minus reflection is another kind of luxury that she cannot tolerate in her life, but she noticed this change. Earthhomes have started their own families. Ekaterina married a young man from a nearby settlement. Malina formed a partnership with a widower who needed help managing the children born from his first marriage. Maria helped them build a home, share resources and knowledge, and establish a mutually supportive family network. She now lives with her elderly mother, who somehow lived to be in her 80s, although most people died from diseases much younger than her. They shared their experiences in Sri Lanka. The two women had gone through the same thing, but their experiences were different. Their relationship was characterized by long, familiar silences and occasional intense conflicts, which would soon fade away, just as they did. Maria's life fell into a pattern that, even if uncomfortable, was at least stable. She wakes up in the dark every morning. She accomplished the tasks that needed to be done. She watched the seasons change according to predictable cycles. Every night when she goes to sleep, she doesn't know if she will wake up the next morning, but she thinks she might. She has become the person young settlers seek guidance, and when officials need information about the history or conditions of the settlement, she will consult her. In a place with almost no official consciousness, she unintentionally became an insignificant authority figure. In the spring of 1852, when Maria was 63 years old, she noticed that it was becoming increasingly difficult to wake up. It's not that it's more painful, but that it requires more deliberate efforts. She felt that she was moving in the water, and everything took more time and energy than she should have done. She realized that these feelings were warning signs that her body was beginning its final decline. She was neither panicked nor sad. She lived long enough to reach old age in the border area, which in itself is an achievement. That summer, she sorted out her affairs, not through full legal arrangements, which were basically impossible in such a remote settlement, but through conversations with her alters and clear oral instructions on how she hoped to handle things after her death. As usual, she worked throughout the summer, but with a new feeling of ending rather than continuing. As autumn arrived, the cold began to strike again, and Maria found herself reflecting on the strange changes that had occurred in her life. She was born in one world but grew up living in another. She survived. This situation could have killed her several times. The environment in which she raised her children was fundamentally hostile to childhood. She maintained her dignity and humanity in an environment constantly threatened to be deprived. She has become an unnamed monument to endurance, and her specific experiences represent the patterns that thousands of other settlers have also gone through, most of which are equally nameless and unremembered. That early winter, Maria passed away in Sri Lanka. She lived there for most of her adult life. Her death was peaceful. She fell asleep and never woke up again. Her body just felt that it was enough. Her altars buried her in a small settlement cemetery, which was a piece of land on a hillside where the soil was easier to dig. Apart from a simple wooden cross, there are no other marks. This cross will rot and disappear within a few years. That those who know her remember not only her entire life, but also the significance it represents. The possibility of maintaining humanity in an inhumane environment continues when it seems impossible to go on. Find a little dignity in daily life, even if it is defined by hardship, repetition, and endless top-minus-down oppression. Maria Sado Arovina's life is not particularly special by the standards of the frontier regions. During the long minus-term expansion of Russians into Siberia, thousands of women led similar lives under similar conditions. But it is precisely her ordinariness that makes her story valuable. She showed us the true meaning of being a frontier settler, not in terms of dramatic moments or heroic achievements, but in terms of survival every day throughout one's life. She told us that most history is created by ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary pressure. The names of these people have never been recorded, but the collective endurance has shaped the world in a way that is easy to overlook but impossible to ignore. Now let's shift from specific issues to puzzles, from personal life to strange archaeological questions. which will arise when we study the physical traces left by these settlers. Zerani itself, those semi-minus buried structures, define the existence of the border and hold mysteries that archaeologists and historians are still striving to fully understand. When the excavation of the ruins of abandoned settlements in Siberia began in the mid-19th century, researchers hoped to find relatively uniform structures, simple air-raid shelters that followed predictable patterns based on actual needs. And the current discovery is much more complicated and perplexing. Some of the entrance tunnels of the Zerani people descend at a steep angle and enter the main living room. Such a design seems unnecessarily complicated. Excavating these elaborately designed entrances requires additional labor, which indicates that they had other purposes besides being simple entrances, but the specific purposes remain unclear. The construction methods for the downward tunnels vary greatly. Some of the sharp drops are close to 45 and then tend to level off, while others form a step descent, which requires careful excavation of the earth staircase and constant maintenance to prevent erosion and collapse. This diversity itself raises the question: are these designs derived from different cultural traditions? Are they actual adaptations to different soil conditions? Or are they merely the personal preferences of builders without standardized plans? Other buildings have multiple rooms, connected by narrow passageways, forming an underground complex that is more like warren than a house. None of these are expansions that have increased over time, but rather original designs that have been carefully considered. Their complexity indicates that planning and intention have transcended improvisation. The multi-chamber design demonstrates evidence of meticulous planning. The positions of the support columns can bear weight loads, and the angles of the channels can facilitate the drainage of moisture that inevitably accumulates in the underground space. The efforts required to build these underground networks are huge, which indicates that residents expect to stay in place long enough to justify the labor investment. If settlements expand or are abandoned, this expectation sometimes comes true and sometimes disappoints. The most puzzling feature of many Zeran is their smoke exhaust system. Simple logic indicates that the smoke vent should be located at the highest point of the roof to allow heat and smoke to escape effectively. But archaeologists found that the angle of the ventilation shaft was very strange. Sometimes it runs a few feet horizontally and then turns upward, sometimes branches into several smaller channels, sometimes aligns to the direction of the celestial bodies in the south or faces the winter sunrise. These designs require more labor to build than direct shafts. The horizontal sections of the ventilation channels are particularly perplexing, as they seem to contradict the fundamental principles of convection. However, when tested in experimental reconstructions, they often create surprisingly effective ventilation systems that can not only effectively extract smoke, but also prevent sinking air currents from filling living spaces with suffocating smoke. These channels sometimes contain clay or stone baffles that seem to regulate airflow in some way, indicating a complex understanding of fluid dynamics. Although this knowledge is clearly based on experience, rather than theories learned through observation and experimentation, and not through any formal physics education, some researchers initially believed that these complex ventilation systems were merely wrong, the result of inexperienced builders trying different methods until a way worked. However, this pattern is too consistent on too many websites and cannot be a random experiment. Furthermore, when archaeologists test the reconstructions of these unusual flues, they often find that they work very well, sometimes even better than simple designs under the same conditions. These settlers clearly had some understanding of airflow and heat management, which is not obvious to modern observers. Recognizing that the pioneers of professional knowledge, contemporary researchers must rediscover this knowledge through scientific tests, which underlines some of the assumptions that these settlements were original or temporary. These structures reveal that they themselves are complex responses to environmental challenges, embodying accumulated wisdom that has been distilled through generations of trials and errors and disseminated through demonstrations and practices, rather than through written manuals or formal guidance. There was one place that particularly caught the researchers' attention. In the 1972, Seven's Ammon Keep Eaple were discovered near the Lena River. All 7 structures share similar unusual features. The entrance tunnel is curved rather than straight, and the inner walls are carefully ground smooth. In some cases, it is covered with birch bark arranged in geometric patterns, and the smoke exhaust outlet seems to be in the same position as the sunrise on the winter solstice. The winding entrance tunnel has no obvious practical use. Straight tunnels are easier to dig and maintain. However, all 7 structures incorporate this feature, indicating that its significance is not merely practical. The birch bark coverings on the inner walls show structurally repetitive patterns with sufficient consistency, indicating that they were intentionally designed rather than randomly decorated. Although it is disheartening that the meanings or representations of these patterns remain unclear, there are also carved wooden stakes at specific locations around and between the buildings at the site, although the signs or representations of these stakes are still uncertain. Are they property boundaries, ritual marks, astronomical observation points, or something else? The placement of these columns is obviously very precise. Their positions from a geometric relationship, seemingly intentional, but the purpose is not easy to explain. Some researchers have pointed out that the lines drawn between the columns might correspond to important celestial arrangements, while others believe that such arrangements could indicate underground water sources, property divisions, or merely convenient locations for tying animals or hanging tools. The cultural relics found from these locations not only failed to solve the problem but also added to the mystery. When mixed with predictable items such as iron tools, ceramic wares and fabric fragments, their uses become less clear. The small clay figurines keep repairing, most of which depict animals, but in an abstract and stylized form, making it difficult to identify them specifically. Are these toys religious items, decorations, or something else? These statues, ranging from rough blocks and almost illegible features to elaborately crafted forms, demonstrate considerable artistic skill, indicating that they were made by different hands, or had different uses in the community. Some were deliberately broken or damaged. Their fragments are scattered in the living area, which may indicate ritual vandalism, accidental vandalism, or simply the disposal of items that have lost their utility value. With chips carved with complex groove patterns were discovered at multiple locations. Some researchers interpret it as a counting rod used to track supply or record time. Others, however, think they might be calendars marking important dates or seasons. Some people have also suggested that they might be pneumatic devices for memorizing oral traditions or songs. The patterns followed by these gaps seem to be systematic rather than random. Repetitive sequences, regular intervals, and occasional special marks stand out from standard cuts, but without a key to decode them, they remain ambiguous texts whose content can only be guessed. The existence of these marked items indicates that the immigrants felt it necessary to systematically record or track something. They did not just live day after day, without long-term plans or memories. These objects themselves do not provide a clear answer. They are merely marked as wood. Their significance entirely depends on the way they are used, and this way of use has vanished with the people who made them. This ambiguity is usually a characteristic of archaeological evidence, but it becomes particularly prominent when studying people who have left almost no written records. Perhaps the most interesting thing was the birch bark container found in the storage room. Birch bark is a commonly used material for making containers due to its flexibility and water resistance. However, the decorated images of some of these containers seem to combine the symbols of the Russian Orthodox Church with designs from the indigenous traditions of Siberia. Next to the cross is a spiral pattern, and next to the names of saints might be stylized animal shapes. This integration indicates that cultural exchange and adaptation occur in ways that have never been captured by official records. Decorative elements demonstrate skilled craftsmanship. Fine lines create detailed patterns, which must take a great deal of time and effort to implement. The fact that such care is put into a simple storage container indicates that aesthetic expression is of great significance, and it is worth the effort even on purely functional objects. Even when survival requires the energy and attention of the majority of people, the impulse to create beauty still exists. With the study of more sites, archaeological evidence of the influence of indigenous people on settler buildings has become indispensable. The basic concept of Zelenka is a partial underground residence that was not originally owned by Russians. For thousands of years, indigenous people across Siberia have been building similar structures and adapting them to specific local conditions and cultural preferences. When Russian immigrants arrived, they initially attempted to build the logic on the ground they knew in Europe and Russia. These structures repeatedly failed under Siberian conditions, requiring too much wood, losing too much heat, being vulnerable to extreme winds, and having difficulty maintaining during the long winter. For surviving settlers were those who learned from their indigenous neighbors, adopted and adapted the underground construction techniques that had been improved over several generations. Under Siberian conditions, the failure rate of traditional Russian architecture is catastrophic. This is occasionally mentioned in the literature. There are reports that settlers froze to death in houses that could not maintain a suitable temperature for living, or buildings collapsed under snow loads that were simply unbearable. The adoption of underground construction technology not only represents practical adaptation, but also the need for survival, which is a fundamental repositioning from imported knowledge to local expertise. Its impact extends beyond the basic structure, including specific construction techniques, the use of turf as insulation material, the strategic placement of storage pits to take advantage of the naturally cold underground temperature, and methods to prevent water seepage through earthen walls. All of these seem to contain local knowledge. Some Irani people have demonstrated evidence of architectural techniques that are clearly native, such as using willow waves to weave vertical columns to create flexible walls that can withstand ground movement during freezing cycles. This technique has no precedent in the Russian architectural tradition, but it is very common among the indigenous people of Siberia. The willow weaving technique demonstrates a complex understanding of materials and forces. Flexible width can bend and move as the ground expands and contracts with temperature changes without cracking, while rigid walls will crack and be damaged under the same stress. The dissemination of this knowledge from indigenous builders to Russian settlers inevitably involved direct guidance and demonstration, and these moments of cross-cultural teaching left no written records. However, the results can be seen in the archaeological remains. Cultural exchange seems to be to minus way, although the evidence in this regard is rather fragmented. Some archaeological sites that are clearly native to Russia show a combination of Russian tools and architectural elements, with iron nails replacing wooden ones, ceramic stove beside traditional fireplaces, glass beads, metal buttons and traditional ornaments mixed together. These exchanges take place at the informal individual level, person minus to minus person and family minus to minus family, driven by actual needs and geographical proximity, rather than any official policies or organized cultural projects. They represent a kind of history, leaving traces in material culture, but rarely appear in written documents. The bidirectionality of communication challenges the simplistic narrative of cultural dominance or resistance, and instead reveals a more complex reality in which people, while preserving the traditional aspects they cherish, adapt to and integrate elements that seem useful. Archaeological evidence shows that either side is pragmatic rather than strictly adhering to cultural purity. No matter where it comes from, people are using it. Researchers attempted to understand indigenous peoples' views on these interactions through oral histories collected later. Although these claims have their own interpretive challenges, some indigenous people described Russian settlers as difficult neighbors who encroach on land, disrupt hunting areas and bring diseases, but other statements recognize a period of cooperation and mutual assistance. In the era when indigenous knowledge helped settlers survive, the settlers' goods provided useful items for the indigenous people. Reality can be complex and ever-changing, varying with time and place, and will never fully conform to the simple narrative of conflict or cooperation. The oral history collected decades, or even centuries after the initial contact period, has been filtered through subsequent experiences and historical developments, which have influenced people's memory and narration of early interactions. However, they offer perspectives that Russian written records do not have, reminding us that every historical encounter involves multiple perspectives. The traces left by settlers exist in larger indigenous existence and knowledge networks that existed before them and continue to exist around them. Why some Sri Lanka designs have proliferated while others have vanished remains a mystery to some extent. Some architectural features spread rapidly among the immigrant population, which indicates that they are so useful that people began to imitate them. Some other features appeared at certain locations and then vanished from archaeological records, possibly because they were proven impractical or because the knowledge of how they were built failed to spread successfully. The pattern of architectural diffusion reveals an experimental process that occurs across several generations. Try all kinds of methods. Keep what works and give up what doesn't. Successfully designed communication must be achieved through observation and conversations with travelers and merchants who bring innovative messages that have proven effective under specific conditions. A successful ventilation system design can spread for hundreds, because people will share the information that works in their own buildings, while failed experiments are quietly abandoned and forgotten, leaving only occasional archaeological traces. However, some design elements were retained, although their actual benefits were not obvious. The arrangement of certain structures with astronomical characteristics falls into this category. Researchers have recorded multiple locations where smoke holes or entrance tunnels coincide with significant solar events, the winter solstice or the vernal equinox. Maintaining these alignments during construction requires additional effort and does not offer obvious practical advantages. The astronomical arrangement is extremely precise and cannot be accidental. The probability of generating such a consistent direction through random construction is very small. However, the efforts to achieve these alignments are considerable and require careful observation of the sun's path, planning to start construction at specific times of the year, and carrying out the work with sufficient precision so that the final structure can capture sunlight or align with the sunrise at the scheduled moment. This arrangement might be purely practical, using celestial events as a calendar to help track the passage of seasons, but they might have cultural or ritual significance that we can no longer access, because these meanings have vanished along with the people who created them, or both are possible. The practical orientation can acquire ritualistic significance over time, or ritualistic practice can be justified through actual benefits. Archaeological evidence alone cannot distinguish these possibilities. This ambiguity reflects a fundamental challenge in interpreting the material, that is, the inability to obtain the faith and interpretation that inspire one's creation. We see the choices people make, such as where to place an opening and how to position a structure, but the reasons behind these choices remain opaque unless they are recorded or preserved in oral traditions. Neither of these two methods survived for these specific groups. Excavation also revealed the existence of some structures that seem to have specific uses beyond being residential. Some underground rooms are clearly storage facilities. There is no fireplace, no living area, and carefully built spaces to store food and items. The others seem to be workshops specializing in handicrafts. Evidence of metal processing, leather processing and textile production was found in a room separated from the main living area. The separation of the workspace and the living space indicates that planning and organization have transcended the minimum survival, suggesting that the community has shifted from the initial desperate struggle for survival to a more stable living pattern that can accommodate specialized labor and task division. The workshop room shows evidence of long-term repeated use, with debris accumulated layer upon layer during the manufacturing process, recording years or decades of production activities. However, the purposes of some structures remain unclear. A carefully built small room that rarely shows evidence of frequent occupancy or special use. There are no archaeological traces left in these emergency shelters, guest rooms, ceremony venues and places where items are stored. The decoration of these rooms is as meticulous as that of the living spaces. The walls are smooth, the drainage system is good, and the roofs are carefully constructed, indicating that they are valued and maintained rather than abandoned, failed or half-finished project. Their completeness makes their emptiness perplexing. People devoted a great deal of labor to creating functional underground spaces, but these spaces were largely unused later on, or at least no physical evidence was left behind. The most mysterious type is those caves that were deliberately filled after construction. They did not collapse by accident or decay naturally, but were deliberately buried with soil and rocks. Why do people invest a huge amount of labor to build underground structures just to fill them up? There is a theory that these might be burial chambers, although human remains are rarely found inside. Another possibility is that they are for some temporary ritual purposes and then closed according to cultural customs that we do not understand, or they are just wrong. The failed experiments did not achieve the expected results and were abandoned. Without the written records or oral history specific to these sites, the structures we left behind raise questions that they cannot answer. Deliberate filling shows organization and effort. The soil and rocks used to fill the cave must be transported and packaged carefully to fully fill the space, which indicates that the enclosure was purposeful rather than random. No matter what the motivation for filling is, it is important enough to warrant considerable effort, which deepens rather than resolves the mystery of why these chambers were first created. Organic materials recovered from some sites offer a glimpse into daily life and complement the evidence of architecture. The fragments of clothes, ropes and baskets preserved under cold and dry conditions demonstrate craftsmanship that combines Russian and local techniques. It's made of local reindeer skin, but cut in a Russian style. The rope combines these two traditions in terms of material and pattern. Baskets woven with local techniques, but in shapes suitable for Russian tools and goods. These mixed items reflect the practical creativity of life on the frontier. People use any effective method to cross cultural boundaries and borrow technology to create new forms that suit their specific circumstances. These clothing fragments show repairs and modifications, added patches, and items that extend their lifespan in cases where replacement is difficult or impossible. Some of the garments were ended multiple times using any available materials, combining Russian fabrics with animal skins, imported threads with plant fibers to create patchwork pieces, demonstrating ingenuity that emerged out of necessity. Food remains tell the story of survival strategies and cultural adaptation. The expected grains and bones of domesticated animals emerged along with extensive evidence of foraging and hunting. The remains of fish, wild birds, small mammals and plant materials that immigrants have learned to utilize. Some food minus making techniques clearly stem from local traditions, such as special methods for drying fish, ways to process certain plants to make them edible, and strategies for extracting the maximum nutrients from animal carcasses. To survive under these conditions, one needs to learn and adapt rather than strictly adhere to foreign traditions. The diversity of food remnants indicates that their diet was opportunistic and diverse, making use of any available food in different seasons rather than relying on a stable supply of preferred foods. The remains of plant materials indicate that people knew which plants in the local area were edible or useful. This knowledge can only be obtained from indigenous peoples who have been developing these resources for generations. The settlement pattern itself is perplexing. Why do some places attract multiple families while others only support isolated ones? Proximity to water and wood is obviously important, but locations that are clearly close to resources show very different levels of occupation. Social factors must have played a role. Kinship networks, conflict dynamics, and the reputation of specific regions. But these factors have left almost no archaeological traces. The structure of some settlements is clearly arranged in accordance with a planned and coordinated pattern. The others seem almost random, scattered throughout the landscape, without any obvious organizational principles. Organized settlements usually have public facilities, shared workspaces, public storage areas, and larger assembly structures, all of which imply cooperation and collective decision-making. The lack of such facilities in scattered settlements indicates that either different social organizations or mere isolation have hindered the kind of coordination required for public infrastructure. Organized settlements tend to be more enduring and appear longer in archaeological records. Dispersed settlements often manifest as brief occupation before being abandoned. But whether an organization leads to or allows stability cannot be determined merely based on physical evidence. The correlation between organization and lifespan indicates that successful settlement requires a certain degree of social cohesion and cooperative planning. Those isolated families struggling to survive are less likely to hold on than those in need of labor and resources. However, the direction of the causal relationship remains unclear. Few people organize because they intend to stay, or do they organize to make them stay? The communication problem between settlements has added another layer of mystery. These communities are far apart and it takes several days or weeks to cross the perilous terrain. However, archaeological evidence indicates that goods, technology, and possibly information flowed among them. The appearance of certain types of tools in multiple locations indicates a common or dissemination of manufacturing knowledge. It cannot be a coincidence that the design elements in the building are distributed over such a large area. Stories and songs may spread along the same path as goods and technologies, although they leave no physical trace. The similarity of the artifacts spanning long distances indicates that these settlements are not completely isolated. They exist within a network of connections and exchanges that bind border communities together, although the scenery between them is intimidating. Compared with the trade routes in more developed regions, these networks are informal and irregular, but their functions are good enough to not only convey goods, but also ideas, technologies and cultural customs. How does this communication network operate without formal infrastructure? The traveling merchants, of course, played a role, transporting goods and news between settlements. Hunters crossing the forest may stop at several places and share information along the way. Although there are few government officials, they will keep in touch with distant communities through patrols. Religious figures travel around to serve scattered people, which will be a channel for spiritual guidance and secular information. However, the details of how news spreads, how innovation spreads, and how collective decisions transcend distance remain largely a mystery. The informal nature of these networks makes it very difficult to trace them in archaeology. Apart from occasional lost items or brief mentions in documents, travelers have left little evidence. These documents focus on business rather than gossip, news and technical information that might constitute the majority of the shared content. However, the influence of the internet is evident in the dissemination of innovation and the flow of goods, demonstrating the connection operating below the of official record keeping. The seasonal rhythms of these settlements are partially visible in the archaeological evidence. Certain activities clearly appear at specific times of the year, leading concentrated remains and fish bones, indicating processing in spring or summer. This is evidence of concentrated production in winter, as outdoor work is impossible. However, the emotional and social rhythms of seasonal life, the anticipation of spring, the despair at the end of winter, and the brief labor intensity in summer can only be inferred and not directly observed. Archaeology provides us with a framework of seasonal patterns, but it does not offer life experiences that traverse the seasons. The concentration of certain types of debris in specific mining layers reveals the annual cycle of activity. For the cyclical experience, the psychological burden of darkness and cold, the relief when the days finally got longer, and the frantic urgency of summer preparations could not be restored from the material residue. We know what people have done, but we can only imagine that feeling. Researchers have found evidence of the winter storytelling tradition. These carved items seem to be narrative aids, and wooden items with continuous images may illustrate traditional stories. But without the story itself, these items would still be incomplete. We can see that the story has taken place. It is important enough to create physical objects to support it, but we cannot restore the actual narrative. This might be the most fundamental limitation of archaeology. It can tell us that meaning exists, but it cannot always reveal what meaning is. Narrative aids are meticulously crafted to demonstrate that the stories they accompany are valuable and that their narration is an important cultural custom. The wear and tear patterns of some cultural relics indicate that they were repeatedly processed, passed down by hand, and used again and again during the long winter when outdoor activities were impossible. People gathered inside to kill time and preserve cultural memory through oral traditions. The rituals and religious issues of these settlements are equally challenging. The presence of religious items, crosses, icons and fragments of religious texts of the Eastern Orthodox Church indicates that Christian customs continue to exist in the border areas. However, these projects often show signs of adaptation and synchronization with other traditional ones. Passes decorated with non-minus Christian symbols, the positions of the icons indicate that they have multiple uses. Fragments of religious texts are used for non-minus religious purposes, such as mending or insulation. Are these signs of the decline of religion under isolated conditions? Or are they practical adaptations to maintaining core beliefs while adjusting practices? Or have true religious innovations created new spiritual forms? Archaeological evidence supports multiple explanations. A mixture of religion and practical functions challenges the simple classification of the secular, suggesting that border residents may not maintain a strict boundary between religious life and daily life, which is a characteristic of more formal religious activities in established communities. The use of religious texts for isolation seems to shock modern people, but it may reflect a pragmatic attitude towards material objects and an internalized belief that does not rely on having physical texts. Some il-anks contain small love or niches, which might be corners of icons or spaces for religious energies in a home setting. But similar niches in other structures are entirely secular items, tools, supplies, and personal belonging. The same architectural features can be used for religious purposes in one household and for practical purposes in another, or may be used for both purposes simultaneously in a way that residents consider necessary to distinguish. This ambiguity reminds us that the categories we use to explain evidence, religious and secular, traditional and innovative, may not reflect how people themselves understand their own actions. Evidence of death and burial customs adds another dimension to this mystery. Cemeteries related to settlements reveal different burial customs. Some tombs are arranged in the traditional Orthodox way, while others are different. Some funerals include burial objects, while others do not. Some show evidence of wooden coffins, while others are simple shrouds. This difference indicates that either Orthodox customs have not been consistently followed, or different families maintain different traditions, or beliefs about death and the afterlife have been continuously developing in the frontier areas. Without written theology or recorded faith, the practices we see cannot fully understand the meaning behind them. Burial customs reveal communities that navigate between tradition and adaptation, retaining some familiar ritual elements while modifying others in accordance with the environment or evolving belief. The differences within individual cemeteries indicate that even small communities contain diverse practices, and there is no single authoritative way of handling deaths that all residents follow. There are a particularly large number of children buried in these cemeteries. This is the mortality rate under these conditions. However, the burial methods for children sometimes differ from those for adults. The graves are smaller, oriented differently, and may or may not have different burial objects. Does this reflect different views on children's mental states, practical considerations of available resources, or emotional responses to the common losses and tragedies? Archaeology shows that children were treated differently when they died, but the exact reasons cannot be explained. A high proportion of children buried attests to the harsh reality of life on the border, where diseases, accidents, malnutrition and exposure are causing young people to die at a rate that modern observers find hard to fully understand. This mortality rate will have a profound impact on the population, affecting every aspect from family structure to community viability and the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. Some cemeteries show evidence of later visits, roads leading to certain graves, small offerings left long after the initial burial, and meticulous maintenance of the tombstones. This indicates that the relationship with the deceased lasted for several years or generations. However, there are no signs of return visits to other graves, which may reflect families that have moved away or become extinct, or which may reflect different cultural attitudes towards maintaining contact with the deceased. This pattern is unpredictable and hard to explain simply. The preserved graves indicate that despite the practical difficulties of life at the border, some families or communities still adhere to the practice of commemoration. It is still very important to remember the deceased, and it is worth continuing to strive for. Unmarked or unvisited graves bring about more disturbing problems, such as isolation, loss of community memory, or families where the entire clan has no survivors to maintain connections. The mystery deepens when we consider those structures that are obviously important, but whose significance we cannot fully grasp. At several locations, archaeologists have discovered areas that seem to be gathering spaces, larger underground rooms. There is evidence that multiple people have reused them, but there are no signs of habitation. These community gathering places for collective labor, just like food processing sites, used for social or religious gatherings or something else. These spaces are deliberately created and maintained, hinting at meaning, but their specific functions remain uncertain. These gathering spaces are often constructed more meticulously than ordinary living areas, featuring more complex support systems and decoration work, indicating their special status or serving purposes that require additional labor input. Evidence of repeated use, compacted floors, accumulated soot on walls, and where patterns around entrances indicate that they are functional spaces actively utilized by the community rather than symbolic structures mainly existing as ideas. One such site has a large fireplace surrounded by neatly arranged stones, which is evidence of long-term and intense use of heat. Its structure is not suitable for metal processing, its shape is not appropriate, its ventilation is poor, and it seems too complicated for simple cooking. Some researchers speculate that this might be a bathish, applying the Russian BA tradition to underground construction. Others, however, think this might be a public cooking facility for large gatherings. Some people still wonder if it is used for ritual purposes, purification, seasonal rituals, or right-of-way. The structure itself is clear. It doesn't mean the meticulous arrangement of the stones and the evidence of sustained high temperatures suggest that its special purpose goes beyond accidental or occasional activities, which means that regular public practice is at the core of settled life, sufficient to ensure the maintenance of the structure. A lack of clear evidence of any single function in itself may be beneficial. Perhaps this space has served multiple purposes at different times, adapting to any public needs. Archaeologists working at these sites often describe a feeling of touching upon meanings that are still beyond comprehension. The evidence is rich and detailed, showing us how people build, what they eat, how they organize space and where they place things. But the reasons behind these choices, cultural logic, personal significance, and collective understanding make these arrangements natural and necessary for those who created them. This is still to some extent opaque. We see the material remnants of life, but we cannot fully restore the consciousness that endows life with vitality. Generally speaking, there is a widespread sense of closeness, but incomplete understanding of meaning in archaeological work. That this sense is particularly strong when studying communities that exist on the fringes of literary culture, as there are no written records of the residents themselves, no letters, diaries or memoirs. We must completely rebuild their lives from those objects and structures that weren't ever created to communicate with future researchers. This is not entirely frustrating, although it seems so. Even after careful study, these border settlements still retain their mystery, which is a very appropriate thing. The people living there exist on the fringes of recorded history. Their experiences are largely unwritten, and their voices are not preserved in archives or official records. Archaeological mysteries reflect the silence of history and all point to life beyond the structures that typically preserve and disseminate cultural memories. In a sense, the persistence of mystery highlights the obscurity of these people's lives. They did not attempt to leave a message for future generations, nor did they consciously create historical records. They just did their best to live in difficult circumstances. Some of the traces they left behind are still hard to recognize, which reminds us that most of the human experiences in history have also not been recorded and cannot be retrieved. We can confidently say that the complexity revealed by physical evidence is far more complicated than that simply described by the hardships of the frontier. These people do not merely survive in desperate conditions, although survival is indeed very difficult. They adapt, innovate, exchange knowledge, choose how to organize their lives and spaces, maintain cultural customs, and at the same time transform them, creating new forms that combine multiple traditional elements. Archaeology shows us this creativity and adaptability, even though it cannot explain every specific choice. The complexity visible in the archaeological records challenges the assumptions that life on the frontier was rough or primitive, revealing communities that, despite isolation and difficulties, still maintained cultural customs, aesthetic emotions and social organization. Even for simple buildings, attention is paid to the decoration of functional items, as well as the maintenance of burial customs and public spaces. All of this indicates that these people are striving to lead a complete human life, not merely for survival. The underground structures themselves, those zelyoni that define the boundary experience, are not as simple as they initially seem. They are not merely holes rooted in the ground, nor are they merely practical solutions to actual problems. They are meticulously designed spaces that reflect accumulated knowledge, cultural values, practical constraints, and perhaps spiritual or cosmological understandings. They are the most fully defined architectural shape spaces, both responding to and helping to create specific lifestyles. The more meticulous the study of the structure, the more obvious the complexity of the Sri Lankan design becomes. The initially rougher and punctured features reveal that they are solutions to carefully considered complex problems, including heating, ventilation, humidity control, and structural stability. These buildings represent the most exquisite local architecture. Their architectural traditions stem from accumulated experience rather than formal training, but after several generations of improvement, they have achieved remarkable results. Many of their design features remain mysterious, but this does not diminish their significance. If there is any difference, it is that these mysteries remind us that our understanding of history is always one-sided, always incomplete, and always irrecoverable. The people who built these buildings and lived in them possessed the knowledge that we have lost. Not only technical knowledge about architecture, but also empirical knowledge about what it means to live underground in Siberia during winter, balancing Russian and local traditions, creating meaning and dignity in an environment that seems to deliberately deprive both. This knowledge cannot be fully restored merely through archaeology, but its traces still exist in the buildings they left behind, raising some questions that require further exploration and explanation. The loss of this empirical knowledge represents a form of historical forgetting, which not only affects these specific settlements, but also countless communities throughout history whose ways of life have never been recorded in writing. We can see that they know something. The evidence shows their ability and comprehension, but we cannot fully restore what they knew, how they learned this knowledge, or what it felt like to have this knowledge. Research on these underground settlements is still ongoing, with new locations being discovered regularly and new analytical techniques being applied to the existing evidence. Each excavation adds new clues to this puzzle, but the puzzle itself has never been fully solved into a complete picture. Perhaps this is what it should be like. These settlements exist on the fringes of the known world, where official knowledge gradually fades away and local knowledge becomes crucial. Even when we study them, they still retain something distant and strange, which seems appropriate. They remain on the periphery in significant ways, not fully integrated into historical narratives, not fully explained by archaeological analysis, and not fully domesticated by academic understanding. Their marginality not only reflects their geographical location but also their status in the system of knowledge and power. It is too far from the authoritative center to be closely monitored, too small to deserve official attention. The lives of the people living there were regarded as having no historical significance by those who controlled the creation and preservation of written records. Our current research on them represents a shift in our perception of the significance of history, but this cannot completely overcome the historical silence caused by their marginal status. They have always existed as mysterious places, where the past is present but not entirely distinguishable. In these places, evidence keeps accumulating, but the meaning remains elusive. In these places we can see the meaning of existence, but cannot fully explain what this meaning is. This ambiguity itself is information, reminding us of the limitations of historical knowledge and the irreducible complexity of human experience. This ambiguity makes us humbly recognize our understanding of the past and how much human experience is beyond our reach forever. Archaeological evidence reveals a great deal of things. Through careful exploration and analysis, we can see a lot about daily life, technology, adaptation, and creativity. However, despite its generosity, it cannot answer all our questions, nor can it satisfy all our curiosity about these vanished communities. The underground structures and mixed cultural customs of these border settlements, their cautious astronomical arrangements and mysterious marker sticks, Their mixed decorative traditions and public gathering spaces continue to raise questions that research may never be able to fully answer. They are like monuments, symbolizing lives on the fringes, symbolizing knowledge that is both possessed and lost, symbolizing the resilience and creativity of humanity in the face of harsh environments, and symbolizing the ultimate wonder of past experiences. We can study them, learn from them, and respect them with our concern and confusion, but we cannot fully grasp their meaning, nor can we fully understand the consciousness of those who build them and live in them, who eventually abandon them in time, the earth and academic thinking. Now, let's stand up from the earth and the mysteries it holds, and turn our attention to a different world, one that exists in the same winter, under the same vast Siberian sky, and in the same landscape. While the settlers were half-minus buried in the frozen land, another group of people lived in warm rooms and gas-lighting corridors. Their lives were affected by the same climate, but wealth, status and the permanence of buildings protected them from the worst. This contrast is not absolute. In Siberia, no one, regardless of their status, can completely escape the shackles of winter. However, the difference between Sri Lankans living underground and those living in brick and stone houses with ceramic stoves is so great that these two groups may be living in completely different worlds. Their lives overlap geographically, but are separated by a huge gap in their daily experiences. In towns such as Kutsk, Teba-Lsk, a small group of merchants, administrators, military officers, and Orthodox clergy maintained a lifestyle borrowed from Europe and Russia while adapting it to the reality of Siberia. None of these are very big cities. Even the largest cities can only accommodate a few thousand permanent residents. But they are the centers of administration, trade and culture, and such centers are rare in this region. The houses of wealthy merchants are a distinct symbol of this different world. These buildings are constructed of wood or bricks, 2 or even 3 stories high, with proper foundations and tiled roofs. These buildings declare the status of their owners through absolute sturdiness. In the Siberian environment, glass windows are rare and expensive. They allow light to enter rooms heated by large ceramic furnaces, and large buildings can heat entire floors when appropriate. Windows are usually double-minus glazed with a layer of air in the middle for insulation, a technology that border settlers could never have imagined. In these houses, the pace of daily life is somewhat similar to that in St. Petersburg or Moscow, but always with the changes of Siberia. Morning did not begin in darkness but under the light. The servants had already gotten up to make a fire and prepare hot water. The owner or mistress of this house will wake up in the bedroom. Although it is cold by modern standards, it is much warmer than the interior of Sri Lanka. The interior walls he won't frost over it. In a sleeping place, breathing does not produce visible clouds. Her breakfast was very sumptuous. They did not eat the porridge and hard bread of life on the frontier, but decent food brought from the warehouse or freshly bought from the market. Tea was at the core of the life of the Siberian elite. It was imported from China along trade routes, making Siberia prosperous, although the majority of its residents remained poor. The tea water is contained in samovars, which are precise metal containers that can keep the water warm. They both function as items and symbols of status. A wealthy family may have several samovars of different sizes and designs, each suitable for different social occasions. The tea itself is drunk in porcelain cups or porcelain cups, with sugar added, and then transported thousands of miles to the dining tables of Siberians. The simple daily ritual of drinking hot tea in a warm room represents a level of comfort that underground settlers living several miles away simply cannot achieve. Compared with ordinary settlers, the food supply channels of elite families are different. Border families eat what they grow, hunt or forage for themselves, while wealthy urban residents can enter markets, where they can purchase goods from Siberia and other regions. Salted fish come from the northern coast and rivers. The flour is imported from the agricultural areas in the south. The bread produced is actually soft and white, rather than black and dense. Candied fruits, jams, dried berries, and even the occasional candied citrus fruits, transported from distant places, offer a diversity that the frontier cuisine has never included. Meat is more diverse and abundant. beef, pork, and sometimes game prepared by skilled chefs rather than being hastily roasted over an open flame. The rich do not undertake most of the household chores themselves. Servants are usually recruited from people who provide food to border migrants. These people have no choice but to light fires, cook, cane runes, fetch water, and carry out countless tasks necessary to maintain a comfortable family. This creates an interesting dynamic where the elite are largely oblivious to the actual challenges on which their way of life depends. A businessman's wife might complain about the cold, but she has no idea at all what it means to someone living underground without sufficient heating equipment. She knew that winter was tough because her servant mentioned this, as sometimes social activities had to be cancelled due to extreme weather and goods were temporarily unavailable. But she believes that all these are inconveniences rather than existing threats. The clothing of the elite class, like their housing, is their hallmark. In Siberia, fur is common among all social strata. The climate demands this. However, the quality and variety of fur have caused a significant difference in status. A pioneer might have owned a leather coat made of local fur, worn it until it cracked, and then mended it for many years. A wealthy merchant may own multiple fur coats made of mink, fox, or imported furs, and each coat represents more wealth than an immigrant family accumulates throughout their lifetime. Under the fur, the elite class was layered clothing made of wool, silk, and cotton fabric, which either requires extensive trading networks or needs to be imported directly. The women's clothing was cut in a style close to the current European fashion, although it was always a few years behind, and additional layers and modifications were made according to the conditions of Siberia to cope with the extreme cold. The coats and trousers that men wear indicate their occupation and status. An officer in uniform, when appropriate. The merchants wore dressed in sturdy and practical clothes, but they displayed high honest quality materials and fine tailoring. The officials' dress indicated their connection with the imperial power. These clothes are not merely for covering up, but for conveying who you are and your status in the social class. The daily routine of the elite class bears little resemblance to the labor pattern of the pioneers from dawn to night. Businessmen may get up at a reasonable time, have breakfast with their families, and then head to the office or warehouse to start their business. This industry is usually the freight trade, which is the main export product of Siberia and also the source of the region's largest accumulation of wealth. Merchants negotiate with hunters who bring furs from the depths of the forest, assess the quality, arrange transportation to distant markets, and manage complex credit relationships spanning years and thousands of miles. This job, of course, requires skills and knowledge, but it is carried out in a heated room, mainly mental labor rather than physical labor, and offers numerous opportunities for profit. A successful fur merchant can become rich by any standard, and the accumulated resources seem fictional to those who truly capture animal furs to create wealth. Administrative officials, governors, tax collectors, judges, and postal administrators maintain the framework of the empire's rule, spanning the vast territory of Siberia. Their work is often unfrustrating, attempting to impose bureaucratic order in areas with almost no maps, recording information on people who frequently move and evade official notifications, taxing the poor, and evading payments in various ways. That this job was carried out in a relatively comfortable and authoritative position. An official might complain about the service difficulties, remoteness, coldness, and distance from cultural centers in Siberia. By local standards, they lived in luxurious houses and exercised powers that frontier settlers could never obtain. But the gap between the official understanding of life in Siberia and the actual situation is often huge. The report sent back to St. Petersburg described the settlement in administrative terms: demographics, agricultural production, taxation, and real life have only a loose relationship. Those officials who ventured to inspect border settlements brought back hard stories that their colleagues in the town office believed were exaggerated or sensational. The bureaucratic institutions simply lack a framework that accurately reflects the actual situation of marginalized life. Therefore, it tacitly accepts the comfortable novel, making the frontier seem more orderly and easier to manage than it actually is. The officers stationed in the Siberian garrison occupy an interesting social status. They were usually minor nobles or ambitious commoners. They chose military service as a way to get promoted. Positions in Siberia were often regarded as punishment or exile rather than opportunities. Even for officers, the conditions were very tough. The daily work in winter is isolated from the social and cultural life in Western Russia, which limits their chances of obtaining military honors that could promote career development. However, compared with ordinary soldiers, especially with settlers on the frontier, the lives of officers were rather comfortable. They live in warmed dormitories, receive regular food supplies from military logistics, and have organized days, including time for leisure and social activities. They held banquets, organized balls in winter, created exquisite social rituals to pass the time, and maintained the illusion that they were still connected to civilized European society. These social events, banquets, balls, and theatrical performances are perhaps the most notable examples of the disconnection between elite life and the cutting-edge reality. While immigrants were struggling to survive in underground dwellings, wealthy Siberians gathered in dance halls with multiple stoves, dressed formally, dancing to the music played by small orchestras, and participating in complex courtship and social positioning rituals. These balls drew on the models of European society, but adapted to the environment of Siberia. They start later in the evening so that they have time to cross the dark and cold streets. They feature local cuisine and food close to European standards. These dances are all familiar forms, such as waltz, pralinazi, and maize cod. They are performed particularly intensely and come from limited social opportunities. For young people in the elite class, these gatherings are of vital importance. They may encounter potential spouses from social alliances or simply enjoy one of the few environments in which their isolated circumstances typically prevent them from doing so. These balls are not only genuine social events, but also manifestations of civilization, a way to maintain connections with the broader Russian culture despite their remote geographical locations. The Orthodox Church maintains an important presence in the towns of Siberia, with priests and clergy serving people scattered in distant places. The church itself is often the most impressive building in any settlement. Wooden or stone buildings with distinctive onion domes, decorated with icy, luminescent, exquisite decorative furniture inside. The social status of clergy is ambiguous. They are educated, have religious authority, and live a more comfortable life than ordinary people. But they are also expected to serve people under very harsh conditions. Travel to remote settlements for baptisms, weddings, and funerals, and maintain religious activities when regular observations are difficult. A devout priest might spend weeks traveling between scattered communities, living in humble places and having meals with families who have nothing to share. However, back in the city, the same pastor would live in the parish priest's quarters provided by the church, have dinner with merchants and officials, and participate in the same social world with other elite members. He exists simultaneously in two worlds, one comfortable and the other difficult, in a way that other elite members usually do not have. Another obvious distinction lies in the educational opportunities that elite children receive. The children of border migrants learn and acquire practical knowledge for survival by observing and participating in survival tasks, but they seldom receive formal education. In contrast, elite children have tutors, sometimes educated servants, sometimes dedicated teachers, and occasionally foreign experts who come to Siberia through various unlikely means. They learn to read and write in Russian, and sometimes they also learn French or German. They study mathematics, history, geography, and religious texts. Girls learn music, painting, and the social achievements they expect. The boys are well-prepared for careers in administration, business, or military services, and lay a foundation for subjects related to these paths. This kind of education is not all excellent. Teachers often do not receive adequate training. Books are very rare. Isolation limits the opportunity to be exposed to new ideas, but it does exist, creating a different way for the future of elite children from that of immigrant children. Health and medicine are another measure of class division. Elite families have the opportunity to see a doctor, although not many and not always trained to European standards. At least they are professionals with some medical education. These doctors can offer treatments, ranging from truly beneficial to harmful. But their existence means that diseases can be treated systematically, rather than through folk remedies or desperate improvisation. If a merchant's child has a fever, the doctor will examine him. The doctor may prescribe medicine for him, adjust his diet and offer specific care suggestions. If a child of an immigrant gets the same fever, his family will treat him with any treatment they know, praying and hoping that the child's survival depends more on the child's constitution and luck rather than any effective intervention. Healthcare is unevenly distributed. Wealthy families can afford better care and more expensive treatment, but its existence marks a fundamental difference in how people experience health crises. The influence of the rhythm of the seasons on the life of the elite is different from that on the life of the frontier. Winter brings the same cold and darkness to everyone, but for the rich, winter is mainly a social season rather than a survival challenge. As it is impossible to work outdoors and travel is difficult, the winter months have become a time for concentrated social activities, with balls, banquets and theatrical performances filling the calendar. On the contrary, summer is the time for elite families to travel, visit other towns, handle business that requires movement, or simply enjoy the almost pleasant short time in Siberia. For the pioneers, the rhythm of the seasons is opposite. Winter is the survival mode. All energy is focused on survival, while in summer it is crazy labor, trying to produce and store enough food to get through the next winter. The same seasons experience, said differently that they can hardly describe the same annual cycle. However, the elite world is more fragile than it seems. The wealth of Siberia is often unstable and dependent on trade networks, which may be disrupted by politics, weather or bad luck. A seemingly prosperous merchant may go bankrupt due to transportation failure, bad debts or changes in fur prices. Official positions offer security guarantees, but they also require the favor of superiors thousands of miles away who may change without any warning. In Siberia, it is rare to get promoted in the military. When promotion opportunities arise, officers who have long worked in remote positions will find themselves forgotten. The lifestyle of the elite requires constant efforts to maintain a continuous navigation of relationships and opportunities, constantly realizing that their comfortable position is not as secure as it seems. Furthermore, the elite life in Siberia also has its own hardships. Although they cannot be compared with those in the frontier, for those who have experienced hardships, this is real. This isolation is profound, cut off from the cultural and intellectual life of European Russia, from family and friends, and from the opportunities and entertainment that make life interesting. The letter took several months to arrive. When news reaches Siberia, it is always outdated. Trends and fashions become outdated before they are adopted. This is true for educated, cultured people and many Siberian elites. This kind of isolation can be psychologically devastating. Women in the elite class face special challenges. People expect them to maintain the behavioral and appearance standards of yore, under extremely difficult circumstances. They should manage their families, raise children, participate in social life and embody civilized values, while living in a place that seems to fundamentally oppose civilization. Many people found that this experience made them feel deeply alienated. During the years spent in Siberia, they longed to return to Russia in Europe. The criterion by which they measured their lives was how long they had to endure before escape became possible. Some people have adapted more successfully and found a meaningful way of life in the Siberian environment. They engage in charitable work, although in such cases, charity often means providing small amounts of assistance to those who are extremely poor and unable to receive meaningful help. They pursue interests in art or knowledge under the constraints of limited resources and audiences. They created social networks that offer genuine connections and support. But even successful adaptation requires constant negotiation between the life they expect and their actual life. The gap between expectations and reality itself is a kind of pain, not as intense as physical difficulties, but for those who have experienced this kind of pain, it is equally real. A relationship between the elite class and the frontier settlers is theoretically complex and often contradictory. Elite families relied on border laborers. Settlers grew food to feed their towns, provided raw materials, served as servants and workers, and through their hard work, made an elite life possible. However, the elite often viewed the settlers with a mixed attitude of pity and contempt. sympathize with their obvious difficulties, and despise their poverty and lack of education. Immigrants are regarded as inferior and unfortunate, but they also deserve the environment they are in due to their own failures or deficiencies. This attitude is neither universal nor consistently intense, but it is widespread enough to form interaction. But official sincerely hope to improve the conditions of settlers, but at the same time believes that they are fundamentally inferior and cannot be improved. Merchants may purchase high-quality immigrant products at fair prices, while also regarding these producers as people with almost no humanity. The pastor may serve the frontier community wholeheartedly, while also believing that they are spiritually backward and in need of correction. For immigrants, their view of the elite class is a mixture of resentment and awe. The comfort of the visible elite life is both inspiring and infuriating, proving that a better life is possible, but it also reminds people that this kind of life is systematically deprived to the majority. Settlers might have been more aware than the elites that their suffering was linked to the comfort of the elites, and that the wealth accumulated in the towns was extracted from the labor of the marginalized under cruel conditions. This understanding rarely leads to organized resistance. This resistance mechanism is almost non-existent, but it creates a tense undercurrent in the interaction among all classes. The power relationship is clearly asymmetrical. Elite members can make decisions that profoundly affect the lives of settlers, set tax rates, determine land allocation, adjudicate disputes, and control market access. When these decisions were unfavorable to the settlers, they had almost no recourse. Apart from passive resistance such as evasion and non-compliance, there is no meaningful way to appeal or resist. This system is not entirely feudal. Settlers are not serfs. They have some legal rights. This kind of relationship is mediated through an official structure rather than personal ties, but it has a deep hierarchical system and offers little protection to those at the bottom. However, this system also requires a certain degree of mutual accommodation. The elite need settlers to maintain vitality and productivity, which means that over-exploitation should not be allowed, leading to population collapse or exodus. Settlers need to establish at least some connection with the official structure or market system, which means maintaining a certain degree of cooperation with institutions controlled by the elite.